Hello, everyone. I am Sharifa A, Chief Diversity Officer and Professor of Finance at the George Washington School of Business. I am thrilled today to welcome you to George Talk Business Series, and which is part of our Diversity and Allyship Week. We devote this week to broaden our horizons and deepen our understanding to become active contributors in fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion within our school, university, and our communities. This George Talk Business event is an important moment in the week-long exploration. This series has hosted influential and well-known leaders from business and government, as well as nonprofit organizations and NGOs. We are proud today. Our session will feature a leader whose insights we can draw from and expand our perspectives on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Inclusivity is what our community strives for. And we know that this point in our global and national community makes our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion all the more important for all of us. We are proud of our diversity. It makes us a strong institution. We celebrate this across the university. This month, starting February 20th, GW will be holding the 9th Annual Diversity Summit. This two-day event will have educational sessions and keynote speakers who will share insights and reflect on what it means to be revolutionary in our quest to bring justice, liberation, and empathy for all. Dialogues like the Diversity Summit and the one we will have today with our guests remind us how public policy, law, and other areas intersect across our society, affecting populations in different ways. With conversations like this, we can build our capacity for both empathy and understanding. These are the foundations to an academic institution as diverse as ours, with students, staff, faculty coming from across the globe and from different walks of life. I am confident that we will learn today from today's conversation. We will gain new perspectives. We will heighten our awareness, which will enable us to be active participants, to be more inclusive members of our community. With that, I would like to thank you for joining us for the George Talk Business and for the Diversity and Allyship Week. Welcome again.
Thank you, Shani, and thanks to all of you for attending our George Talks Business session today. We are privileged to have today as our guest, Sharifa A. Anderson, who is Senior Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Fannie Mae. Sharifa, welcome.
Thank you.
We look forward to hearing your insights, and welcome to all of you. This is one of several opportunities during Diversity and Allyship Week to feature a voice from outside of our GW community, one that is both influential in the housing arena, but also influential in essentially affecting diversity and inclusion practices for an entire industry. So without further ado, I'm going to ask a few questions and we'll have a chat, and then I will open it up for questions from the audience, which we will take through Pigeonhole. So let's begin. So can you tell us something about your background and how you found yourself as Chief Diversity Officer at Fannie?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I get started, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to have the dialogue with you and all of the work that you have done to advance diversity and inclusion. I just want to say thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
So, my journey, I'll just sort of start from the beginning. I was born in Boston. I am a daughter of immigrants from Jamaica who met in Boston and settled in a neighborhood called Jamaica Plain. When I think about my childhood neighborhood, there were many things that I think influenced my aspirations from a career perspective. Jamaica Plain at the time when I was growing up was incredibly diverse. It was diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, language use, accent, socioeconomic status. And it was diverse in terms of housing stock. On one side of my community, there was public housing, lots of examples of vacant and scattered vacant and abandoned properties and lots. And the other side of the neighborhood was luxury, high-end housing, pond-side mansions that are make Jamaica Plain more known. And when I think about the community assets, there weren't mainstream grocery stores. There was no retail bank. So where we shopped were bodegas. Check cashing places was very much a part of my community's life. And so I say all that to really just sort of paint a picture about my early understanding of community assets and how that led me to a place of really wanting to begin a career that was about expanding access and opportunity for folks who didn't have those opportunities. And so, early in life, I started on this path of, I started articulating a desire to become a lawyer. I didn't have any lawyers in my family, but I saw law as a vehicle to advocate for access and opportunity for others. And so that's really where it began. There were sort of lots of things in between that. I will say that over the course of my career, I didn't go to law school immediately after undergrad. I worked as an economist. I did policy school. I worked as a policy analyst. Left, my first chapter at Fannie Mae was working on housing policy issues and mission issues, and then I left to go to law school. But as I think about the journey that I had from sort of econ to sort of policy to law, and then sort of leading up to diversity and inclusion, that work was very much about expanding access, whether it was, building affordable housing, partnering with companies to come up with innovative solutions to increase access to credit. And so in many ways, I felt like I was doing the work of diversity and inclusion, though not in a dedicated role. When I had the opportunity, at my last company to really step out of my legal role, my company was making the decision to create a dedicated office of diversity and inclusion that stood outside of HR. And it was important for us to really position the office in that way, because D&I was not just about talent. It was about all of these access. It was about thinking about how we deliver different services to the communities that historically hadn't been served. And so I raised my hand to be considered for that role, and had the opportunity to really build be at the ground floor of building our first diversity and inclusion strategic plan, and really thinking deeply about what it meant to be comprehensive and what it meant to embed D&I into everything that my prior organization was doing. So fast forward a little bit. I was recruited to come back to Fannie Mae in a similar role, but clearly a platform that enabled me to do all of the things that I, aspired to do in terms of expanding access. And so it has been, my role as a Chief Diversity Officer at Fannie Mae is similar in some ways, but we have some opportunities to influence the industry that look different than they did at my prior organization. And so, it's pretty exciting. Mm-hmm. It's pretty exciting work, but I do think that there are folks that I talk to about this diversity and inclusion work that are coming from lots of different sort of academic backgrounds, career backgrounds, and there is very much an advantage to having, I think, an interdisciplinary approach to this work. And so I can see how all of those things prepared me to do the work that I do today.
Wow, it is very exciting. You were at one point a senior business manager
Yes.
at Fannie. So what did you learn from that sort of informs your work as a diversity officer?
Yeah.
How did that sort of shape, or did it shape your perspective?
Yeah, a really great question. It's interesting. As I was, I started at Fannie Mae as a policy analyst and sort of moved into increasingly sort of progressive roles. And so as I was leaving Fannie Mae, that was my my sort of final chapter. One of the things that I did in that, through that body of work was I had the opportunity to partner with organizations across the country that were trying to solve housing challenges that were, impacting their neighborhoods. So whether it was sort of vacant housing, whether it was a foreclosure crisis, whether it was sort of public housing and trying to figure out how to sort of renovate communities. And so one of the things that we really thought deeply about at that time was we were so used to talking about our impact in terms of dollars and numbers of units built, numbers of units renovated, and we started to think about the outcomes differently. So the conversation became, what does it look like to build, to be part of building a healthy community? And when I think about all of the things that we sort of tossed out as variables that might tell you a story about the health of a community, I take that same lens to the work that I do today, right? It's not just about while we talk about representation, and we know, it's not just about the number. It's about how we work, how we interact, how we make decisions. And so I think, that lens around data and measuring impact is very much present in the work that I do today.
Huh, interesting. I find this fascinating, not just because it's fascinating, but because, I started my career at Freddie Mac, went back second time, went to graduate school. So we have that in common. I started as a financial analyst doing policy work on housing challenges. So I just didn't know there was another person like me.
Yes. Yes.
And I remember when, in my time when I was at Freddie Mac, people would often ask me, what is it that Freddie Mac does? Mm-hmm. And I had my little, soundbite explanation. So I'm curious how you talk about Fannie Mae's business to people who may not have, obviously everyone's heard of Fannie Mae, but may not be familiar with what actually it is the organization does.
So we are, Fannie Mae was chartered in the 1930s, really with the mission of providing liquidity to the mortgage market. And so, we don't originate mortgages. As you know, we buy them, we package them, and we sell them to investors. And through that process, we create liquidity for the mortgage banks to be able to originate more mortgages for homeowners that are desiring to purchase properties. And so that sort of at a very basic level is the business of Fannie Mae. How we do that work has absolutely shifted over time. I think we are thinking more deeply today than we ever have before about what it means to provide liquidity in a way that we're serving all of the communities that, and in particular communities that haven't been served. And so that, that's a little bit about our business, but I think layered on top of that, important to who we are. We're a company of almost 8,000 employees. We are geographically dispersed. I'm going to talk a little bit about representation and why I think it matters. More than half of our workforce identifies as a person of color. When we look at our leadership team, we've got tremendous diversity there. Our board, tremendous diversity there. And the reason I think those things are important is because as we look at the demographics of this country and what we know is ahead and even present today, is a tremendous opportunity to really serve a broader set of households. And so I think the diversity together with the kind of culture that we've created really give us room for people to bring more to our workplace, more to our problem solving, more to our innovation, more to our sort of service delivery model, and really thinking about the obstacles that communities are facing. And so as important to the sort of what we do, the who we are, the how we do it, all of those things really matter. And this discussions about diversity and inclusion aren't just about the diversity, right? It's about what is the culture you're creating. And coming back to Fannie Mae, one thing that I can say is so clear and so sort of deeply sort of rooted across our company is this passion for creating spaces of inclusion and creating spaces of psychological safety that enable our talent to really show up in the fullest way possible and contribute to our solutioning.
Thanks. Yeah. I want to build a little bit on something you said. You said the way that you provide liquidity has changed. And so I want to probe a little bit about that because, diversity and inclusion related issues have been huge topics in the housing industry. And so I'm curious if you could give some examples of things that Fannie Mae is doing to sort of expand diversity and inclusion in the housing industry as it's because of its sheer size. You have a tremendous impact on the way the industry operates. So a few examples. One of the things that 20 years ago when I was at Fannie Mae, we had lots of conversations about creditworthiness and how we evaluate the creditworthiness of a borrower and whether the models that were existing really gave us enough information to really understand that. Coming back to Fannie Mae, in just the past couple of years, we've introduced, the innovation that we've introduced about being able to use your rental history as an indication as part of the understanding about risk and creditworthiness has been, I think, a game changer for communities that may not have established the same kinds of credit histories as others. And so that's one of the things I think we're really proud of is really understanding how communities bank differently, how they leverage credit differently, and what really are the factors that can tell us a more complete story. Another example I think that we've been thinking deeply about is, there have been lots of conversations over recent years around appraisal bias and how that shows up in the housing process. And a couple of things that we know are true. The diversity of the appraisal industry is not. It doesn't reflect the communities that we aspire to serve. And so
we've established an appraisal diversity initiative where we're providing support for folks to really enter that space and to support a more diverse industry. We're also using AI to look at appraisals, to identify where the bias might be showing up, and that gives us some space to understand, right, what we know have been sort of established patterns over time. How is it still showing up today, and are we able to catch it? And so those are a couple of examples. I would say that we recognize that our position in the marketplace is one where we can partner, where we can influence others. And so in 2018, we established a Future Housing Leaders program where we partner with other financial institutions to really support a more diverse housing industry. When I think about when I was coming up, I talked about the lack of retail banks in my neighborhood. I didn't know banking was a real opportunity for me. So it's real sort of really interesting to reflect on how I arrived in a space where so much of my career has been in or adjacent to financial institutions. And so through our Future Housing Leaders program, we are introducing people to housing and financial services that might not otherwise see this as a career path for them. And it's not just about sort of introducing folks to careers, but it's also the education and the support that we're providing. And so I think that's something that we're really proud of. We're on a journey where we're listening and learning and constantly innovating. And so I'm looking forward to more to come.
Awesome. So I want to go back just for a second for folks who may not necessarily be familiar with the appraisal bias issue. And I know it's complicated. Yeah. I also am familiar with some of the work that researchers at Fannie have done, really answering a lot of the questions about that and sort of resolving whether or not it's an issue. It's clearly an issue. Yeah. But could you talk just a little bit about what is the concern and the impact of appraisal bias?
Yeah. So ultimately, when you're looking to sell your house, what the research showed was that folks who lived in, and in particular, people of color who were selling their homes were finding that the value of their property was much lower than that of white households. Such that there were, studies being done where folks would remove any evidence of ethnicity or race from a household to understand how that shifted an appraiser's valuation of property. And so, understanding that led to lots of other questions, I think, about sort of what does the appraisal industry look like, appraiser industry look like? What is actually being documented in some of the appraisals? And there was evidence of language that suggested and made it not just suggested, made it very clear that households were being valued differently based on what neighborhoods they lived on, who lived in the house. And so that, I think that really led to the work that we're trying to solve from our position in the marketplace.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. So switch gears just a tad bit. How would you describe the current state of the diversity and inclusion industry? Or diversity and inclusion in the industry, however you'd like to answer.
Yeah. I think that the narratives around diversity and inclusion have become very confused. And there's, in some, there's sort of a misunderstanding, maybe at best, In some cases, it feels more intentional. But I will say that, despite, and we're seeing companies that are backing away from diversity and inclusion, we're seeing legal challenges that, a lot of folks are worried about. And so all of that, while all of that is happening, I also see a number of companies that are doubling down on their commitment, and D&I leaders who are, putting their sort of feet to the fire to continue this work, and that is really encouraging. And so I would say that, and we need that. We need to be holding each other accountable in this time. So while the narratives are confusing, I think there are opportunities for us through conversations like this to really educate people on what it is we're talking about, right? We talk about the words diversity and inclusion. What are we really trying to accomplish? And so much of the work that we do at Fannie Mae is about understanding how bias shows up in our processes and our systems, and how do we eliminate bias? And that serves all of us. Mm-hmm. And so if you understand diversity and inclusion in that way, I think you have a very different appreciation for the work. But that's not the narrative that's being told in many spaces. And so, it's troubling. But on the other side of that, I see folks who are steady in the work, who are moving forward. And I'm really proud to be at a company where we're doing just that. I will also say that, when I think about diversity and inclusion, what I've come to understand, and I think, others talk about this often, is this work is so much bigger than one chief and one office, right? So when we think about companies that are appointing chief diversity officers and hiring teams, the real test, all of that is important, but the real test is this model of how is the work shared across your organization? Mm-hmm. Because it's so much more, as I said, it's so much more than one person or one team. It's really got to be embedded in everything that you do. And so, as I think about, there's tremendous opportunity. And I hope as companies are thinking about what diversity and inclusion looks like for them, it is really with this sort of, this focus on how are we really sharing and supporting this work, and how are we building accountability models that affect all of our leaders and people.
That is actually very reassuring to me, because I think if the more we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion from a sort of embeddedness perspective, that was your word, then it ceases to become sort of this kind of separate kind of unit or thing or one group's responsibility. Right. Yeah, good one. So I'm gonna try to see if I can take some questions from the audience. While I do that, could you talk a little bit about your employee resource groups? Because over the course of our Diversity and Allyship Week, that has come up.
Yeah. So at Fannie Mae, we've got 10 employee resource groups. Wow. And it's pretty exciting to see the dimensions of diversity that, that are reflected there, that we're, creating connections around how allyship is showing up in those communities. I will say at my prior organization, I was at the early stage of our employee resource group journey. It was really at the beginning of our journey with our my prior company's journey around ERGs, and I have found them to be incredibly important vehicles for connection, for understanding, but also what what we see through our employees is that people, our talent across the organization is sort of stepping out of their day jobs to really lead and shape culture, and that is just it's remarkable to see the way that our employee resource groups are doing that. And so, when I talk to talent that's coming into our organization, I encourage folks to get involved because there's, you're exercising skills you might not in your day-to-day job, you're shaping culture, you're building community. And when I think about what I saw in my past organization, and even as I arrived at Fannie Mae, our employee resource groups were tremendous in helping us navigate when we all sort of went to our respective homes and were navigating through the pandemic. They were a source of connection and community even in that time, and that has been true at Fannie Mae too.
Cool. So if you have questions, please remember to use your QR codes to submit them, and we'll do what we can. What career advice do you have for the students in our audience, and in particular, we've got one from a law school student? So,
I think when I think about my journey, it's been being open to new challenges, exploring the new challenges with a sense of curiosity. You might have your ideas about where you're going to land, and I certainly didn't know anything about a chief diversity officer role when I was coming up, and frankly, there were probably not many of them at that time. But I see, but by being open to different possibilities, I think I've, come into a space that is really rewarding work, and work that enables me to have an impact. And so when I'm talking to folks about career choices and aspirations, it's keep challenging yourself, stay curious, build relationships, get to know people to try to understand how they lead, how they navigate their work, how they're on this sort of continuous learning journey. And I'm happy to talk to folks who are, more intimately, who are on this law school journey and otherwise.
Awesome. I wish you had been around to give me this advice, or anyone. I would have not made nearly as many mistakes as I did along the way. You talked about the changes in the industry that you've seen. How do you see your role changing in the future?
Yeah. It's interesting. I think that, diversity and inclusion, it's already changing. When I was entering the work, it was very much a conversation around talent and culture, and not a conversation around business strategy. And that has been, I think, game changing for folks to really be able to connect that. And so when we think about the skill set of a chief diversity officer, it's, yes, we've seen, folks who have grown up in HR functions leading the way, but we're also seeing folks that have grown up in legal roles, or folks who have grown up in strategy roles, in marketing roles, and all of those skill sets are really necessary to do the work that we do. And so, again, sort of goes back to, right, we can't do it alone. You got to have an interdisciplinary team of folks who are really partnering with you to advance the work. When I look at my team, we've got folks who were risk leaders, who were auditors. We do have HR leaders, but it really is a cross-section of people who are data analytics folks who are really contributing to the way we think about the work, the way we tell the story about the work. So I think the field will continue to evolve, and there's just, I think, a tremendous amount of potential.
Awesome. Sharifa, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining us for of George Talks Business this go round for diversity and allyship. Have a great evening.